What started as a simple meditation session turned into the most terrifying supernatural experience of my life. When I attempted astral projection for the first time, I had no idea that my soul would get lost in a realm filled with dark entities and ancient evil. This is my true story of being trapped between dimensions, where malevolent spirits tried to prevent my return to the physical world. In this chilling account, I share exactly what happened when my consciousness separated from my body and encountered supernatural forces that shouldn't exist. From shadow beings stalking me through twisted landscapes to demonic entities attempting to possess my abandoned physical form, this paranormal experience changed everything I thought I knew about the spiritual realm. You'll hear about the terrifying moment when I realized I might never make it back to my body, and the desperate fight for my soul that followed. This true supernatural horror story explores the dangerous side of astral projection that spiritual guides don't warn you about. Experience the terror of being completely vulnerable in a dimension where evil entities hunt lost souls, and discover why some people who attempt astral projection never fully return the same. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you chills, subscribe for more terrifying true stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our supernatural content. Comment below if you've ever experienced anything similar. I'd love to hear your paranormal encounters. Astral projection, also known as out-of-body experiences, has been practiced for centuries across different cultures and spiritual traditions. While many practitioners report positive experiences during astral travel, there exists a darker side to this phenomenon that involves encounters with malevolent entities, soul entrapment, and spiritual attacks. The astral plane, according to esoteric teachings, contains multiple layers and dimensions where both benevolent and malicious beings reside. When inexperienced practitioners attempt to separate their consciousness from their physical body without proper protection or knowledge, they risk encountering predatory entities that feed on human spiritual energy or attempt to possess vacant physical forms. This supernatural realm operates under different laws than our physical reality, where thoughts manifest instantly and negative emotions can attract dangerous spiritual beings. The psychological impact of such encounters often leaves lasting trauma, with many experiencers reporting persistent paranormal activity in their lives, sleep disturbances, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen forces. Astral projection, supernatural horror, true horror stories, paranormal experience, out-of-body experience, spiritual horror, demon encounter, soul trapped, astral realm, horror story, supernatural entity, paranormal activity, true story, horror narration, scary stories, ghost stories, supernatural terror, haunted experience, psychic attack, spiritual danger tags, video tag list, astral projection, out-of-body experience, supernatural horror, true horror stories, paranormal experience, spiritual horror, demon, encounter, soul trapped, astral realm, horror story, supernatural entity, paranormal activity, true story, horror narration, scary stories, ghost stories, supernatural terror, haunted experience, psychic attack, spiritual danger, meditation gone wrong, consciousness, spiritual realm, dark entities, malevolent spirits, possession, shadow beings, dimensional travel, esoteric, occult experience, complete video script, 10,000 words, 5 paragraphs of 2,000 words each. I should have died that night. Actually, let me rephrase that. Part of me did die that night, or at least got so lost in the supernatural realm that I'm still not entirely sure I brought all of myself back. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago in my apartment in Denver, Colorado, and it's taken me this long to even be able to speak about it without having a complete psychological breakdown. If you've ever been curious about astral projection or out-of-body experiences, please hit that like button right now and listen very carefully to what I'm about to share, because what happened to me could happen to anyone who attempts this without understanding the true dangers involved. My name is Michael, and up until that October night, I considered myself a pretty rational person. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company downtown, lived a predictable routine, and the most supernatural thing in my life was occasionally watching ghost hunting shows on Netflix. But I'd been going through a really difficult period. My long-term relationship had ended, work stress was crushing me, and I felt spiritually empty in a way I'd never experienced before. That's when my coworker Sarah introduced me to meditation and what she called consciousness expansion techniques. She'd been practicing various forms of meditation for years and swore that astral projection had changed her life, giving her access to spiritual wisdom and a sense of connection to something greater than herself. For weeks, Sarah shared books with me, guided meditation videos, and stories about her own out-of-body experiences. She described floating above her physical body, traveling to distant locations instantly, and meeting spiritual guides who offered profound insights about life and existence. It sounded incredible, almost magical, and honestly, I was desperate for something to fill the void I felt inside. She assured me that astral projection was completely safe when done properly, just a natural extension of meditation that humans had been practicing for thousands of years. Looking back now, I realized she either didn't know about the dangers or chose not to mention them. I started with basic meditation, learning to quiet my mind and focus on my breathing. After a few weeks of daily practice, I progressed to visualization exercises designed to help separate consciousness from the physical body. The technique Sarah taught me involved lying perfectly still while maintaining awareness, imagining a rope hanging above my chest, and mentally pulling myself up along that rope until I felt my astral body separate from my physical form. She warned me that the first few attempts might not work, that it often took months or even years to achieve a full out-of-body experience. But I was determined, maybe even obsessed. Every night after work, I would dim the lights in my bedroom, lie on my back with my arms at my sides, and spend hours trying to project. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened except occasional sleep paralysis episodes that left me feeling drained and uneasy. During these episodes, I would become conscious but unable to move my body, sometimes sensing a presence in the room with me. Sarah said this was normal, just my consciousness beginning to separate, and that I should push through the discomfort. The breakthrough came on a Friday night in late October. I'd been practicing for about 6 weeks, and my meditation sessions had become deeper, more intense. That particular evening, I felt different from the moment I lay down. There was an electric energy in the air, almost like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, and my body felt unusually heavy and relaxed. As I began the visualization process, imagining myself pulling up along the invisible rope, I felt a strange tingling sensation starting in my chest and spreading throughout my entire body. The tingling intensified until it became almost painful, like every nerve ending was being stimulated simultaneously. Then, suddenly, I felt the most peculiar sensation I'd ever experienced. It was as if I was being pulled upward while simultaneously sinking downward, a dizzying contradiction that made my head spin even though I was lying perfectly still. My heart started racing, but not my physical heart. It was something else, some other part of me that was panicking as reality began to shift around me. That's when it happened. With what felt like a soft pop, like a soap bubble bursting, I found myself floating 3 feet above my own body. I could see myself lying on the bed below, eyes closed, breathing slowly and peacefully, completely unaware of what was happening. The sensation was indescribable. I felt lighter than air yet completely solid, present yet detached from everything I'd ever known about existence. I tried to move my arms and realized I didn't have physical arms anymore, just some kind of energy form that responded to my thoughts. For a few moments, I was filled with wonder and excitement. Sarah had been right. This was incredible. I could move in any direction just by thinking about it, and I felt more conscious and aware than I'd ever been in my physical body. The room looked exactly the same, but somehow different, as if I was seeing it through a filter that revealed subtle details I'd never noticed before. Colors seemed more vivid, and there was a faint luminous quality to everything, as if all objects were emitting their own soft light. I experimented with movement, willing myself to float toward the window, then back toward the bed. Every motion felt natural and effortless, like swimming through air. I looked down at my physical body again, marveling at how peaceful and vulnerable it appeared. That should have been my first warning. The word vulnerable kept echoing in my mind, though at the time I dismissed it as natural nervousness about this new experience. But then I noticed something that made my non-physical stomach drop with dread. The room wasn't empty except for my sleeping body and my floating consciousness. There were shadows in the corners that hadn't been there before, and they weren't behaving like normal shadows should. They were moving independently of any light source, writhing and shifting like living things. As I focused on them, trying to understand what I was seeing, they seemed to become more solid, more present, as if my attention was feeding them energy. One shadow in particular, lurking near my bedroom door, began to take on a vaguely humanoid shape. It was tall and impossibly thin, with what might have been arms that were far too long for its body. As I watched in growing horror, it turned what I assumed was its head toward me, and even though it had no visible features, I could feel it looking directly at me with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. The air in the room, which had felt light and energizing just moments before, suddenly became thick and oppressive, like trying to breathe underwater. Comment below if you've ever felt that sensation of being watched by something that shouldn't exist, that primal terror that tells you you're in the presence of something fundamentally wrong. That's exactly what I was experiencing as this shadow entity focused its attention on me. But this was just the beginning. What I didn't realize was that by successfully separating from my physical body, I had essentially announced my presence to every dark entity within a massive spiritual radius, and they were all beginning to converge on my location. The shadow figure began to move toward me with a flowing motion that defied physics, not walking or floating, but somehow folding the space between us until it was much closer than it should have been able to get in such a short time. I tried to move away from it, to float back toward my body, but I discovered something terrifying. I couldn't remember how to return to my physical form. Sarah had taught me the projection technique, but had never properly explained the return process, assuming it would be instinctive. In that moment of panic, trying desperately to reconnect with my sleeping body, while a malevolent entity approached, I realized I might be in serious supernatural danger. The shadow entity's approach triggered something I can only describe as a supernatural alarm system going off throughout the entire astral plane. As it drew nearer, more shadows began emerging from impossible places, seeping through the walls like liquid darkness, rising from the floor like smoke, and descending from the ceiling as if gravity had no meaning in this realm. Each new presence brought with it a wave of malevolent energy so intense that my astral form actually began to vibrate with terror. I want everyone watching this to understand something crucial. When you're in your astral body, emotions are amplified tenfold. The fear I was experiencing wasn't just psychological. It was a physical force that threatened to tear my consciousness apart. Hit that like button if this story is already giving you chills, because what happened next will haunt your dreams. As more entities materialized in my bedroom, I noticed that each one was distinctly different, as if they came from various levels of whatever hellish dimension I had accidentally accessed. Some appeared as writhing masses of shadow, with multiple appendages that moved independently, while others took on more humanoid forms, but with features that were wrong in ways I still can't adequately describe. Faces with too many eyes, limbs that bent in directions that violated anatomy, and mouths that opened far wider than should be physically possible. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't their appearance, it was their behavior. They weren't randomly wandering around my room, they were coordinating, communicating with each other through some method I couldn't perceive but could definitely feel. It was like being surrounded by a pack of predators that were strategically positioning themselves for an attack. I could sense their excitement, their hunger, and their complete lack of anything resembling human compassion or mercy. These entities viewed me as prey, nothing more than spiritual nourishment that had conveniently separated itself from its protective physical shell. The tall, thin entity that had first noticed me seemed to be their leader, or perhaps the most powerful among them. As it came closer, I could feel its attention like ice-cold fingers probing at the edges of my consciousness, testing my defenses, looking for weaknesses it could exploit. When it finally reached the space directly above my physical body, it did something that filled me with a terror so profound, I thought my astral form might simply dissolve from the shock. It began to descend toward my sleeping physical form, clearly intending to enter my vacant body. I screamed, but no sound came out in the way I understood sound. Instead, my terror manifested as a wave of psychic energy that rippled through the astral plane, and to my horror, this seemed to excite the entities even more. They began moving faster, more aggressively, and I realized that my fear was literally feeding them, making them stronger and more capable of manifesting in the physical realm. The shadow entity hovering over my body turned its attention back to me, and I felt its amusement at my panic like a knife sliding between my ribs. That's when I discovered something about the astral realm that no meditation guide had ever mentioned. Distance and space work differently there. One moment I was floating 3 feet above my bed, and the next moment I was somehow in what appeared to be a completely different location, though I hadn't consciously moved. The room around me was still recognizably my bedroom, but it was wrong in subtle ways that made my non-physical skin crawl. The walls were the same color but seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The furniture was in the right positions, but appeared to be made of some organic material that glistened wetly in the strange light. This was my first glimpse of what I later learned was called the lower astral realm, a dimension that exists parallel to our physical reality, but is influenced by negative emotions, fears, and malevolent entities. It's like a twisted mirror version of our world, where everything familiar becomes threatening, and every shadow might conceal something hostile. The entities that had been gathering in my bedroom were now fully manifested in this lower realm, no longer trying to hide their true nature or intentions. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more about the different levels of the astral plane, because what I discovered that night challenged everything I thought I knew about spiritual reality. The entity that had been attempting to possess my physical body was still there, but now it was joined by dozens of others, all focused on me with predatory intensity. They began to circle around my astral form like sharks scenting blood in the water, and I could feel their hunger growing with each passing moment. The worst part was that I could still see my physical body back in the normal version of my bedroom, lying peaceful and unprotected on the bed. But now there were entities gathered around it too, testing the boundaries of my vacant flesh, looking for ways to enter and claim it as their own. I realized with growing horror that if they successfully possessed my physical form while I was trapped in this nightmare realm, I might never be able to return to it. My consciousness could be permanently exiled to this hellish dimension, while demonic entities used my body for whatever dark purposes they had in mind. That's when I tried to fight back, to assert some kind of control over my situation. I attempted to will myself back to my physical body, concentrating with every ounce of mental strength I possessed. But instead of returning home, I found myself being pulled deeper into the twisted landscape of the lower astral realm. The bedroom faded away entirely, replaced by what I can only describe as a maze of corridors that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The walls of these corridors were made of the same organic material I'd noticed in the distorted version of my bedroom, and they pulsed with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat I'd ever heard. The entities followed me into this maze, and their numbers continued to grow. Some crawled along the walls like spiders, others floated through the air with movements that hurt to watch, and still others seemed to phase in and out of the walls themselves, as if the barriers between dimensions meant nothing to them. As I fled through the twisting passages, I began to understand the true danger of unsupervised astral projection. This wasn't just a spiritual adventure or consciousness expansion exercise. It was like wandering alone and defenseless through the most dangerous neighborhoods of the supernatural world. Every wrong turn could lead to encounters with entities that were older than human civilization, beings that had been feeding on lost souls for millennia and knew every trick for trapping unwary spiritual travelers. The pursuit through the maze felt like it lasted for hours, though time seemed to work differently in this realm. Sometimes I would turn a corner and find myself back in a corridor I'd already traveled, as if the maze was reconfiguring itself to prevent my escape. Other times, I would run down a straight hallway only to find myself somehow approaching from the opposite direction. The entities herding me through this supernatural labyrinth seemed to find my confusion and growing desperation amusing, their malevolent laughter echoing off the walls like the sound of breaking glass. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories like this one, because what happened next taught me why experienced practitioners warn against attempting astral projection without proper spiritual protection. During my frantic flight through the maze, I began to notice that the entities weren't just chasing me randomly, they were driving me toward a specific destination, like predators herding prey toward a trap. Every time I tried to turn in a certain direction, they would block my path or create obstacles that forced me to choose a different route. Eventually, the corridors opened into a vast chamber that defied architectural logic. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own consciousness, while the floor was covered in what appeared to be a thick black liquid that reflected no light, despite the strange illumination that permeated the space. In the center of this chamber stood something that made every entity I'd encountered so far seem harmless by comparison, a towering figure that radiated such pure malevolence that just looking at it caused my astral form physical pain. This was clearly the master of this realm, the apex predator that ruled over all the lesser entities that had been hunting me. As it turned its attention toward me, I felt my consciousness beginning to unravel under the weight of its focus. This wasn't just a supernatural entity. It was something that existed to consume souls, to devour the very essence of conscious beings and add their spiritual energy to its own power. And I had delivered myself directly into its domain, separated from my physical body and completely defenseless against its attack. The master entity's attention felt like being crushed under an avalanche of pure malice. As it focused on me, I experienced something that no human consciousness is designed to handle: direct contact with intelligence that was both vastly superior to human awareness and utterly committed to causing suffering. This wasn't the kind of evil you see in movies or read about in books. This was primordial wrongness, the source from which all lesser forms of malevolence spring. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because even now, months later, I struggle to understand what I had encountered in that supernatural realm. The entity began to speak, though not in any language I recognized or through any method of communication that involved sound. Instead, its words appeared directly in my consciousness like burning brands, searing themselves into my awareness with such intensity that I feared they might permanently damage my sanity. It told me that I had entered its domain voluntarily, that by separating my consciousness from my physical body without proper protection, I had essentially offered myself as a sacrifice to the inhabitants of the lower astral realm. But what terrified me most wasn't what it said, it was what it showed me. With a gesture of one of its impossible appendages, the entity caused the chamber walls to become transparent, revealing the true scope of this nightmare dimension I had stumbled into. Stretching in all directions were countless other chambers, corridors, and spaces, each filled with trapped souls who had made the same mistake I had. Some appeared to be recent arrivals like myself, still maintaining their human-like forms and fighting desperately against their supernatural captors. Others had been there so long that they'd been transformed into something barely recognizable as formerly human consciousness. The entity explained with cruel satisfaction that time worked differently in this realm, that what felt like minutes here could be years in the physical world. It showed me images of my physical body lying motionless on my bed while days, weeks, and months passed in the real world. I watched in horror as my body withered from lack of sustenance, as concerned friends and family members found my corpse and struggled to understand what had happened to me. Meanwhile, my consciousness would remain trapped here forever, slowly being consumed by the denizens of this hellish dimension until nothing remained of who I had once been. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what happened next revealed the true mechanism behind spiritual possession and why some people who attempt astral projection are never quite the same afterward. The master entity began to demonstrate its power by showing me how easily it could manipulate my physical body even from this distance. Through some supernatural connection that linked my consciousness to my flesh, it caused my physical hands to move, my sleeping body to shift positions on the bed, and most disturbingly, my mouth to speak words in a language I didn't recognize. This revelation filled me with a new level of terror. The entity didn't need to travel to the physical realm to possess my body. As long as my consciousness remained trapped here, it could use me as a puppet, controlling my physical form while I watched helplessly from this supernatural prison. I imagined my body rising from the bed, walking through my apartment, interacting with people while this malevolent intelligence controlled every action. The thought of my friends and family unknowingly dealing with this entity wearing my face like a mask made me desperate enough to attempt something incredibly dangerous. I tried to sever the connection between my astral form and my physical body, hoping that by cutting myself loose entirely, I might deprive the entity of its ability to control my flesh. But the moment I began to concentrate on breaking that spiritual tether, every entity in the chamber converged on me simultaneously. They didn't attack in the way you might expect. Instead, they began to merge with my consciousness, forcing their way into my awareness like parasites burrowing into healthy tissue. The sensation was indescribably violating. These entities weren't just touching my mind, they were becoming part of it, inserting their thoughts and memories into my consciousness until I couldn't distinguish between my own experiences and theirs. I lived through centuries of their existence, felt their hunger for human suffering, experienced their joy at corrupting and consuming lost souls. For terrifying moments, I couldn't remember who I had been before entering this realm, couldn't recall my human life, or understand why I was resisting their integration. That's when I discovered something crucial about consciousness and identity. They're far more fragile than most people realize. When your awareness is separated from the anchor of your physical body and exposed to beings that exist purely as consciousness, you become vulnerable to a form of spiritual contamination that can fundamentally alter who you are. I could feel aspects of my personality being rewritten, my memories being edited, my very sense of self being dissolved and reformed according to the entity's desires. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because the battle for my soul was just beginning. Through sheer force of will, I managed to create a small pocket of resistance within my own consciousness, a tiny space where I could still remember my human identity and maintain some semblance of individual thought. From this mental fortress, I began to fight back against the invading presences, using techniques I somehow knew despite never having learned them, as if the desperate situation had awakened some primal knowledge about spiritual warfare that exists within all human consciousness. The struggle was exhausting in ways I never knew were possible. It wasn't physical combat, but something far more fundamental, a battle for the very essence of what made me who I was. Every moment of concentration required enormous effort, and I could feel my strength waning as the entities pressed their advantage. They were ancient and experienced in this form of warfare, while I was a complete novice desperately improvising defensive strategies. But as the battle raged within my consciousness, I began to notice something encouraging. The entities were expending energy too. Their assault on my identity wasn't effortless. It required them to invest significant portions of their power in maintaining the attack. And more importantly, I realized that my resistance was actually causing them pain. Human consciousness, it seemed, wasn't meant to be consumed easily. We possess something, call it free will, divine spark, or simply stubborn independence, that makes us naturally resistant to spiritual domination. This discovery gave me hope and renewed my determination to fight back. Instead of just defending against their attacks, I began to actively push back, using my memories of human love, joy, and connection as weapons against their invasive presence. Each time I focused on a positive human experience, my childhood dog, a beautiful sunset, the laughter of friends, the entities recoiled as if burned by acid. They were creatures of pure negativity, and direct contact with genuine human positivity was agony for them. The master entity, watching this spiritual battle from its throne-like position in the chamber, became increasingly agitated as I proved more difficult to consume than expected. It began to take more direct action, abandoning its role as overseer to personally join the assault on my consciousness. When it entered my awareness, the pain was indescribable, like having molten metal poured directly into your brain while simultaneously being electrocuted and frozen solid. But even as I screamed in agony that transcended physical sensation, I held on to one crucial realization. This entity's direct involvement meant it was worried. If consuming my consciousness was supposed to be routine, it wouldn't need to personally intervene. My resistance was actually working, and more importantly, I was learning how to fight back against supernatural forces that had seemed omnipotent just moments before. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because the techniques I discovered for spiritual self-defense during this battle might save your life if you ever encounter similar entities. The Master Entity's assault revealed something important about the nature of these beings. They were powerful but not all-powerful, ancient but not indestructible, and most crucially, they were bound by certain rules that governed supernatural interactions with human consciousness. As our battle intensified, I began to understand that my accidental entry into their realm had created a two-way connection. Just as they could influence my physical body through our link, I could potentially affect their realm through the same connection. This realization would prove crucial for what happened next, as I prepared to attempt something that was either brilliant or absolutely suicidal. I was going to try to use my connection to the physical world to drag these entities back with me, potentially unleashing them into reality, but also potentially giving me the home field advantage I desperately needed. The decision to attempt pulling the entities into the physical realm with me was born from pure desperation. But as I began to focus on strengthening my connection to my physical body, something unexpected happened. The entire lower astral realm began to convulse and shift around us. The organic walls of the chamber started bleeding a substance that looked like liquid starlight, while the air itself became thick and syrupy, making movement increasingly difficult for all the entities present. It was as if my determination to return home was causing some kind of supernatural earthquake that threatened the stability of their entire dimension. The Master Entity's reaction to this development was immediate and terrifying. It abandoned its assault on my consciousness and instead began to grow larger, its form expanding until it filled nearly half the chamber. As it grew, its appearance became even more nightmarish. What I had initially perceived as appendages revealed themselves to be the twisted remains of other souls it had consumed over the millennia, their faces still visible and screaming silently from within its mass. The sight was so horrifying that I felt my sanity beginning to crack under the pressure of trying to process something so fundamentally wrong. But then the entity made a crucial mistake. In its rage at my resistance, it showed me the full extent of its power, and in doing so, revealed its limitations. I could see the supernatural threads that connected it to every soul it had consumed, the energy patterns that maintained its dominion over this realm, and most importantly, the fact that its power was largely derived from the fear and despair of its victims. Every soul trapped in this dimension was feeding it energy through their terror, creating a cycle of consumption that had sustained it for countless ages. This revelation gave me an idea that was either genius or complete madness. Instead of trying to escape alone, I began reaching out to the other trapped souls in the chamber, attempting to communicate with them through the same method the entities had used to speak to me. The process was incredibly difficult. Most of these consciousnesses had been imprisoned for so long that they barely remembered their human identities, but buried deep within each one was still a spark of what they had once been, a core of human experience that the entity hadn't been able to completely devour. Comment below what you think really happened next, because what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about the power of human consciousness when it's united against supernatural evil. As I managed to establish contact with more and more of the trapped souls, I began to realize that the master entity's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It had consumed so many human consciousnesses that it had inadvertently created an army of potential rebels within its own being. Every soul it had absorbed still retained some fragment of free will, some tiny portion of their identity that remained unconquered. Working together through a form of telepathic communication I still don't fully understand, we began to coordinate our resistance from within the entity's own structure. It was like being cancer cells that had suddenly decided to work together against the host body. We were already inside its defenses, already part of its essential nature, and it couldn't expel us without destroying itself in the process. The other entities in the chamber began to panic as they sensed what was happening, but it was too late. We had achieved something they had never encountered before: unified human resistance from within their master's own consciousness. The battle that followed defies description using normal human language. It took place simultaneously on multiple levels of reality: physical, mental, spiritual, and dimensional planes that I didn't even know existed. I could feel my physical body thrashing on the bed back in my apartment as the supernatural conflict raged through my consciousness, while my astral form fought alongside dozens of other souls against the invasive presence of ancient evil that had been masquerading as invincible. But the most intense part of the battle occurred when the master entity, realizing that its usual tactics weren't working, attempted to fundamentally alter the nature of reality around us. The chamber began to collapse and reform repeatedly, cycling through different configurations as the entity tried to create an environment where human consciousness couldn't survive. One moment we were in the organic cave-like structure, the next we were floating in a void filled with acid rain, then suddenly trapped in a maze made of crystallized screams from previous victims. Through each transformation, I held on to two crucial anchors: my connection to my physical body and my newfound alliance with the other trapped souls. No matter how the environment changed around us, these fundamental links remained constant, providing stability in a realm where nothing else could be trusted. The entity threw everything it had at us: psychological torture that made physical pain seem pleasant by comparison, illusions designed to make us doubt our own existence, and direct attacks on our consciousness that felt like having our souls flayed alive. Hit the like button if you're still with me, because what happened next will give you nightmares for weeks. As our resistance continued to weaken its control, the master entity made a desperate gambit. It began to tear holes in the fabric between dimensions, attempting to escape to other realms where it could rebuild its power base. But each tier it created also offered us potential escape routes, and more importantly, it destabilized the entire lower astral realm in ways that even this ancient being couldn't control. Reality began to unravel around us in cascading waves of chaos. The other entities that had been hunting me earlier were swept away by dimensional storms that reduced them to their component energies, while the very concept of space and time became meaningless as past, present, and future began to overlap and merge. I witnessed my own birth, death, and every moment in between happening simultaneously, while also experiencing the life histories of every other soul trapped in this collapsing dimension. It was during this moment of total chaos that I finally understood the true nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. We aren't separate from the universe around us. We're focal points where cosmic energy becomes aware of itself. temporary organizing principles that allow the fundamental forces of creation to experience existence from a unique perspective. This realization gave me access to power I never knew I possessed, the ability to assert my will not just over my own consciousness, but over the basic structure of reality itself. Using this newfound understanding, I began to weave a new pathway back to the physical realm, not just for myself, but for all the souls that had joined in our rebellion. It was incredibly difficult work, like trying to build a bridge while standing in a hurricane, with the master entity fighting our every effort, and the collapsing dimension threatening to erase us from existence entirely. But human will, when focused and united, proved to be far more powerful than any of us had imagined. The master entity, sensing that its realm was about to be completely destroyed and its power permanently broken, made one final, desperate attack. Instead of targeting our consciousness directly, it reached through our connection to the physical world and began to assault our abandoned bodies. I could feel supernatural claws tearing at my flesh back in Denver, could sense the entity's rage as it tried to destroy our physical forms out of spite, even knowing that doing so would eliminate its own chances of escape. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories like this one, because the battle for our physical integrity, while our consciousness fought for our physical integrity, while our consciousness fought in multiple dimensions, simultaneously required a level of mental focus I didn't know was humanly possible. I could feel every scratch, every supernatural wound being inflicted on my body back in the apartment, while simultaneously coordinating our escape efforts with the other trapped souls and maintaining my resistance against the master entity's final desperate assault. The pain was beyond description. Imagine having your physical body tortured while your mind is being torn apart by cosmic forces, all while trying to perform complex mental calculations that could determine whether you live or die. Several times I felt my concentration wavering, my connection to both realms beginning to slip as the dual assault threatened to overwhelm my capacity to process such intense supernatural experiences. But just when I thought I might lose consciousness entirely and be permanently trapped in the collapsing dimension, something miraculous happened. The other souls we had liberated began to share their own connections to the physical world, creating a network of spiritual anchors that distributed the burden of maintaining our escape route. Some had been trapped for decades, others for centuries, but each one still retained some thread linking them to the reality they had once known. Together, we formed something the master entity had never encountered before, a collective consciousness that was greater than the sum of its individual parts. The pathway back to the physical realm finally stabilized, appearing as a tunnel of pure white light that cut through the chaos of the collapsing dimension like a sword through darkness. But the master entity, even in its death throes, had one final trap waiting for us. As we began to move toward the escape route, it revealed that returning to the physical world would carry a terrible price. We would bring traces of the lower astral realm back with us, potentially contaminating the physical dimension with supernatural corruption that could spread like a virus through human consciousness. This revelation created a moment of horrible uncertainty among our group. Was it worth escaping if doing so might unleash supernatural evil into the physical world? Could we live with ourselves knowing that our freedom might come at the cost of innocent lives? The master entity, sensing our hesitation, began to laugh with a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming children, knowing that human compassion might accomplish what all its power had failed to do, keeping us trapped forever. The decision to proceed with our escape, despite the risk of supernatural contamination, was perhaps the hardest choice any of us had ever made. But as the dimension continued to collapse around us and the master entity's laughter grew more manic, we realized that staying would guarantee the spread of evil. The entity would eventually find another way to break free, and when it did, it would be stronger than ever, having consumed all our souls to fuel its escape. At least by leaving together, we had a chance to contain and control whatever corruption followed us back. Like the video, if you're still following this terrifying journey, because what happened during our transition back to the physical realm defied every law of physics and spiritual reality I thought I understood. As we entered the tunnel of light, time seemed to fragment and multiply. I experienced my entire life flashing before my eyes, but not in chronological order. Instead, I saw every moment of joy, love, and human connection I'd ever experienced simultaneously, as if my consciousness was trying to reinforce my human identity before returning to physical form. The other souls were going through similar experiences, and I could feel their memories and emotions blending with my own in ways that should have been overwhelming, but instead felt oddly comforting. We were no longer individual consciousnesses fighting alone. We had become something new, a a collective entity that retained all our individual humanity while sharing our strength and wisdom across the group. But the master entity wasn't finished with us yet. As we moved through the tunnel, it launched one final desperate attack, not against our consciousness this time, but against our memories of what had happened. It tried to erase our experience, to make us forget the supernatural realm entirely, so that we would return to our bodies with no knowledge of the dangers we'd encountered, or the techniques we'd learned for spiritual self-defense. This would leave humanity vulnerable to future attacks, with no one aware of the threat lurking in the lower astral dimensions. Fighting off this assault while maintaining our journey toward the physical realm required us to do something extraordinary. We had to deliberately choose to remember trauma. Most consciousness naturally tries to forget painful experiences, to protect itself from psychological damage. But we forced ourselves to hold on to every terrifying detail, every moment of supernatural horror, because forgetting would mean that others would face the same dangers we had, unprepared and alone. The transition back to physical reality was like being born again, but in reverse. Instead of leaving a warm, safe environment for a bright, confusing world, we were leaving chaos and terror for the familiar comfort of our physical bodies. The sensation was indescribable, like liquid fire flowing through every nerve ending as my consciousness merged with flesh that felt foreign after my time in the spiritual realm. I opened my eyes in my bedroom to find my apartment in shambles. Furniture had been overturned, windows were cracked, and there were scratch marks on the walls that looked like they'd been made by claws far larger than any earthly animal could possess. My physical body was covered in cuts and bruises that corresponded exactly to the supernatural attacks I'd felt during the final battle with the master entity. Most disturbing of all, my bedroom walls were covered in symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the drywall as if something with incredible strength had been trying to create some kind of summoning circle. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because what I discovered next proved that our escape had indeed brought supernatural contamination back with us, but not in the way any of us had expected. Instead of evil entities following us into the physical world, we had brought back something else, the ability to perceive supernatural activity that had always been present, but hidden from normal human awareness. The scratches on my walls weren't new. They had always been there, left by previous encounters between the physical and spiritual realms that I had simply been unable to see before my consciousness had been expanded by exposure to the lower astral dimensions. Over the following weeks, I began to notice supernatural activity everywhere I looked. Shadow figures moving just at the edge of my vision, strange energy patterns around certain people and places, and most unsettling of all, the constant presence of entities that seemed to be monitoring human activity from just outside our normal perceptual range. The other souls who had escaped with me reported similar experiences. We had all become unwilling psychic sensitives, able to perceive spiritual reality whether we wanted to or not. But this enhanced perception came with unexpected benefits as well. I could now sense when people were being influenced by negative entities, could detect supernatural threats before they became dangerous, and most importantly, I could teach others how to protect themselves from spiritual attacks. The knowledge we had gained during our battle in the lower astral realm wasn't just useful for our own survival. It was information that could help protect all of humanity from supernatural predation. Comment below if you want to know about the protection techniques I learned, because what I'm about to share could save your life if you ever encounter similar entities. The most important lesson from my experience is that human consciousness is far more powerful than most people realize, but it's also more vulnerable than we've been taught. When we separate our awareness from our physical bodies through meditation, astral projection, or even certain types of dreams, we enter spiritual realms where different rules apply and where entities exist that view human souls as prey. The protective techniques I learned aren't complicated, but they require genuine understanding of how consciousness interacts with spiritual reality. The most basic protection involves maintaining a strong connection to your physical body and your human identity, never allowing yourself to become completely absorbed in the spiritual experience. More advanced techniques involve creating psychic barriers using focused intention, learning to recognize the energy signatures of different types of entities, and most importantly, understanding that fear is literally food for malevolent spirits. Maintaining emotional control is not just psychological advice, it's a survival necessity in supernatural encounters. 3 months after my terrifying experience in the lower astral realm, I still struggle with the consequences of what happened that night. I have persistent insomnia, not because I'm afraid to sleep, but because I now perceive too much supernatural activity during the night hours to rest comfortably. I've had to completely rearrange my living space according to spiritual protection principles I never knew existed, using specific arrangements of mirrors, salt, and blessed objects to create barriers against unwanted entities. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of returning from such an extreme supernatural experience is the isolation. Very few people are equipped to understand or believe what I went through, and even fewer want to hear about the spiritual dangers that surround us constantly. I've become part of a small community of people who have had similar experiences, individuals who have touched the darker aspects of spiritual reality and lived to tell about it. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you for listening to my story. Whether you believe every word or think I'm completely insane, please remember this crucial warning. If you ever decide to experiment with astral projection, out-of-body experiences, or any form of consciousness expansion, never attempt it alone, and never do it without proper spiritual protection. The realms beyond physical reality are real. They are populated by entities that do not have humanity's best interests at heart, and once you've opened the door to supernatural perception, you can never fully close it again. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who might benefit from this warning. And remember, the supernatural world is always watching, always waiting for an opportunity to interact with human consciousness. The only question is whether you'll be prepared when that interaction occurs, or whether you'll become another lost soul feeding the appetites of entities that exist in the shadows between dimensions. Stay safe, stay protected, and never forget that some doors once opened can never be completely closed again.